This talk will follow very nicely on the heels of what Dr. Roth presented in terms of a background on foot and mouth disease and some of the challenges associated with vaccination. So I've been fortunate enough to be part of the team, myself at Davis, Iowa State, individuals at Iowa State, as well as University of Minnesota, who have been involved for the last couple years working on developing a secure milk supply. And what I'd like to do today is there have been a number of talks on some of the continuity of business planning projects at a number of meetings. And so I'm not really going to focus on sort of the past very much in terms of what we've done, but I'd like to share with you some of the current challenges we had, some of the current initiatives, and where we're looking at to go with the secure milk supply plan going forward. So, as all of you are aware, foreign animal disease response planning is moving in a new direction, and that involves continuity of business planning in advance of foot and mouth disease or foreign animal disease outbreak for the various livestock commodity groups that may be affected. And the diseases for which these plans are tailored are different depending upon the industries that are involved in the planning process. But the Secure Milk Supply Project, what we initially chose to focus on was what was felt to be the most critical, timely movement that would exist for the dairy industry if there was a foot and mouth disease outbreak, and that was the movement of raw milk from farms in an affected area and ultimately potentially affected farms to commercial processing. And so this partnership that involves industry, state, and federal animal health response officials as well as academia has been going on now for about 3 years. And we've laid, I think, a very nice groundwork for dealing with some of the critical issues in the early phases of an outbreak and moving specifically raw milk. And a lot of our thought process, I think, has been focused on somewhat of smaller outbreaks. And where we're moving now going forward is thinking about managing these outbreaks, the continuity of business needs in large-scale outbreaks that may last quite a long time. Like Dr. Roth mentioned, in terms of the types, we're talking about maybe a type 3 to type 5. So to recognize the folks that are working on these projects nationally, these projects at the academic centers are funded through USDA Veterinary Services. We have now a number of state and regional efforts that are in various phases of maturity, some of them very, very far along. The risk assessment components of these projects are done in a collaboration with Centers of Epidemiology and Animal Health and individuals working on behalf of the University of Minnesota who are co-located at that center. Recently, we put together some new graphics to try to help people understand where the state and regional projects are ongoing and how they overlap with the main centers of dairy production across the United States. So this image here depicts the currently existing state and regional efforts and sort of notes them in the context of how many animals are involved in that state or region, the number of farms that would be in that region, and the percentage of national or U.S. milk production that's represented by the region. And as Dr. Roth pointed out previously, that there's a great degree of diversity in terms of the dairy industry across the United States. And that's one of the big challenges is in particular in dealing with continuity of business for dairies or the dairy industry. One size does not fit all, and that's why the approach that's been taken is to try to develop a national framework, an umbrella, and one component of that is what we call the biosecurity performance standard. So it's biosecurity guidance for farms, processing plants, and milk haulers that need to be accomplished in order that raw milk movement can occur while mitigating the risk of disease spread. But how exactly you might execute that in one part of the country versus another, getting ultimately the same end effect. It's sort of the concept that the gentleman who was speaking on risk assessment was talking about. You want the same end goal of not spreading the disease, but how that might be accomplished is going to vary at the state and regional level, hence the importance of these projects. And I think another great success from this project to date has been the ability for these projects to share and network. We have quarterly calls where, they're all open to anybody, But materials that are developed in one state and region are discussed, and if another state and region are interested, people are sharing those things. So we can kind of leverage work done in on behalf of one project to the benefit of others in the group. So it really helps us move forward more collectively and in a better coordinated way. And so I'll flip back and forth a little bit, but these are the current states and regions that are involved in secure milk supply planning, just kind of overlaid on the top 10 dairy states by milk production. So, just a quick glance tells you that, we're doing pretty well, but there's still some, we'd still like to get other states and regions on board moving forward. And hopefully that will become easier as some of the materials that I'll share with you a little bit later on are developed and easier for people to access. So we're working together towards a common goal, and I mentioned some of the accomplishments to date include the development of the biosecurity recommendations or biosecurity performance standards. Those are currently in the process of being updated and revised in the context of the risk assessment that was recently completed. So we will, hopefully in the next month or so, have the new set of recommendations available. Good news is that there's not a lot of things that have changed. There's a couple things, new recommendations, but biosecurity basically remains a critical component of moving milk, and the recommendations are largely as they were initially. We were able to get a citric acid exemption, which that was working with the US EPA and USDA Veterinary Services to get an emergency exemption that would allow the use of citric acid, which is effective in killing foot-and-mouth disease, but wasn't specifically listed as one of the approved disinfectants. It's readily available, it's inexpensive, it's relatively innocuous to the environment, and so that we feel was a really important accomplishment of the project. I mentioned the baseline risk assessments done. Another series of documents that were put together and made available through the national program as a general resource include materials that would help train herd health monitors. So an important component to being able to move milk in the face of continuity of business, or in the context of continuity of business, is actively observing for signs of disease. There may be supplemental testing that occurs. That may or may not be possible given the size of the outbreak and other testing demands. But having individuals on farms that are trained to observe specifically for signs of foot-and-mouth disease and then report those daily as required to the incident command. So we developed a set of training materials to help accomplish that, both help people understand the concept and then actually train the boots on the ground people who would be doing that. And then I'll also mention moving forward some of the draft recommendations that we've been working on. The purpose of these draft recommendations is to get dialogue and discussion in advance of an outbreak on some of these really important topics that could potentially really impact our ability to respond quickly, efficiently, and effectively. And by having some of these tough discussions up front, we're going to be better positioned to get things moving quickly if we are faced with an outbreak. So there have been a number, Dr. Roth mentioned some estimates of the cost of an FMD outbreak in the United States and what it costs in the UK versus Uruguay. There's a number of different estimates that have been put forth over time using different models and different economic impact assessments. But the number is large and very large enough that it's really important that we do see the value in investing in planning and preparedness ahead of time. This particular study is a study that focused on the very dairy-dense region of the California Central Valley, and ultimately all economic impacts taken into account. The estimate was that for each hour of delay, or each hour that the diagnosis is delayed, could cost up to $565 million an hour. So this is a very dairy-dense region where disease could spread very rapidly, affecting many dairy farms. So perhaps one of the worst case scenarios, but certainly a substantial economic impact is there. And as Dr. Roth touched on too, the traditional ways we responded to this disease are no longer appropriate for the types of livestock industries that we now have in the United States. And so we no longer, for large outbreaks, can dig holes and shoot and bury cows. So that's why these new concepts in terms of emergency response planning are really important. And I will, Dr. Roth mentioned the length of time it may take us to recover our bilateral trade with countries that we export to. This example shows how long we've taken historically to recognize other countries who have been faced with a foot and mouth disease outbreak to re-accept product from those countries. So, like he pointed out, what has happened in the past in terms of what we accept from others is likely to be what we will be challenged with. So we need to be prepared to deal with these larger long-term outbreaks. So some of the main challenges, I'm going to touch on 3 of these in particular, but in the context of managing large long-term outbreaks in the dairy industry, we've been trying to encourage dialogue and help generate consensus on acceptable options for handling milk from infected farms. We realize that in large long-term outbreaks, disposing of milk for very long periods of time is probably impractical. So I'll provide some more information on that discussion in a second. We also need to start thinking about calf rearing. Many of the large commercial dairies across the United States use off-site calf rearing, and so we need to start people thinking in the context of it's unlikely that live animal movement is going to be allowed from dairies in affected areas. So how can we be prepared to raise these animals on the farm for some short period of time? And then in addition, how can we also safely allow the other necessary movements onto and off of dairies in affected regions that would support these dairies staying in business? So feed movement, manure management, cropping, etc. Another important component that needs to be in place in order for these programs to be enacted quickly is potentially a pre-certification process. So if you wait till if the outbreak occurred today and we had to go out and certify that all of our dairies and our haulers and our processors were meeting the guidelines that were necessary according to the biosecurity performance standards to move milk, it might be months before we could get any substantial part of that population to be cleared to move milk. So this all needs to occur ahead of time, and I'll share with you some of the materials that we've been working to develop in California to try to help accomplish that process. The Mid-Atlantic Secure Milk Supply group is also moving forward now with their set of training, pre-certification and training materials. So it's kind of an exciting time. They're both sort of in pilot phases, demonstration phases, early rollout phases. But those materials being available will help make it easier for other individuals to come on board and start to get involved in this process. Critical to all of this is information management, both for the pre-certification process as well as information exchange during an outbreak to make sure those in decision-making roles within the incident command are getting the information in terms of who's been certified to do what ahead of time when there's that pre-certification component, but also to be able to support the large-scale permitting that will be necessary for these movements to occur. All of these movements we're talking about need to be permitted through the incident in the face of a response. And then finally, it's great to have so many folks in the room today that have expertise in terms of the import-export. So I'll share a concept that we've been talking about in terms of an opportunity perhaps for the dairy industry to maybe mitigate some of that risk in terms of loss of exports for certain commodities and products that they most commonly trade. So Dr. Roth touched on the types of FMD outbreaks, and so in the context of issues that need to be addressed relative to large-scale, long-term outbreaks, one of the key issues is going to be the management of milk from affected farms, and these may actually be infected farms. We've heard reference to the outbreak in Uruguay already, so I'll mention before starting this discussion that in Uruguay, the way they approach disease control, they never dumped a load of milk during that outbreak. They never depopulated actually a dairy in that outbreak, but they did make decisions about how they would process the milk that came from affected farms. They had affected farms that were, their affected farms or their infected farms were never depopulated. And in many cases, they came back and vaccinated those dairies after those animals, the disease had sort of blown through the dairy, so to speak. It had run its course of disease. So what they chose to do was to move that milk to condensed milk processing because they had a fair amount of capacity for that in the country. What we need to do here in the context of the United States is to determine what we think as a whole is going to be a consensus approach for managing these large volumes of milk should we be faced with a large outbreak like that. So what Dr. Roth and I did to help start the dialogue was to develop a white paper. Our intended audience was industry and government, and what we're trying to do is stimulate discussion, dialogue, and ideally some pre-event consensus on options that would exist. The idea is that if we have this dialogue ahead of time, we can be more functionally prepared to manage these outbreaks successfully in the long term. And so, really our choices are limited. If we're dealing with large volumes of milk from affected regions or infected dairies, we can either dispose of that milk or we can process that milk. And if we dispose of it, that's really, in the context of a large-scale outbreak, not consistent with continuity of business planning, because what we're trying to do is keep dairies in business, right? But there are a lot of challenges associated. This kind of goes to some of the precautionary principle discussion that we heard earlier this morning in terms of thinking about what happens if you do nothing. So if we do nothing and we choose not to process that milk and not prepare to handle that milk, we're going to be left with a very substantial environmental challenge in terms of managing large volumes of milk in these big outbreaks. So in terms of what's our other option? Well, foot and mouth disease, we all know it's not a human health concern. Milk from FMD affected countries and infected farms is consumed daily around the world in sometimes vaccinated, other times unvaccinated populations. But some of the concerns here that come out have to do with messaging and consumer concerns about that milk entering the food chain. So if we decide to process that milk, because it would be safe and wholesome food if it was processed under the pasteurized milk ordinance, it could move into normal commerce. It could move into processing into non-fluid milk products, things that are more highly processed, heat-treated, desiccated. It could be processed in ways that require extended heat or pH. And ultimately, we could talk about whether or not it's okay for that to be sold to consumers, or perhaps the feeling is that people think it should go to feeding animals, again, given that it's treated properly so that there's no risk of infection. So this discussion is very similar to the discussions that are occurring in the meat processing industry in terms of processing cattle or swine that may be from affected areas that have an unknown status that could be in early phases of disease. In processing animals under the FSIS current inspection process, that helps to assure that only healthy animals that are fit for human consumption enter the food chain. Along similar lines, if we continue to pasteurize milk under the pasteurized milk ordinance, which sets the standards and inspection processes for grade A milk, we should have the same assurances that the milk that is being processed, as well as those milk products, are completely safe for human consumption. That's sort of the basic principle. So we received comments, we had this out for comment for about 3 weeks. We received comments from 6 groups, sets of consolidated comments, as well as 10 individuals. In general, there was agreement with the proposal that this milk should enter commerce in some way and be processed. There was no strong opposition noted to date and no proposed alternatives in terms of large-scale milk disposal options. We had a webinar about a week and a half ago where we had further discussion of the comments we'd received to date, invited additional input, and then received comments up until the 27th. So we're currently in the process of updating our initial white paper based on those comments, and it will be recirculated hopefully in the next week or two for additional comments. Some of the general comments we received were, I guess were that we didn't really necessarily put in context what the white paper was in terms of all the other work that had been done with the secure milk supply. So we're addressing the comments that we've received in terms of clarifying the biosecurity required to move such milk, clarifying, we're going to add some language about the safety of milk from vaccinated cattle. That was a kind of a topic that came up several times in some of the comments we received. And so we'll look forward to sharing that with you all in the near future. So I'm going to move forward now to my next topic, which is a little bit of information about some of the pre-certification options in the materials developed to date, specifically as part of the California Secure Milk Supply. So the goal of this pre-certification process is to make entities eligible to be permitted. So you can't pre-permit, right? A permit can only be issued in real time. So we're pre-certifying people to help make them eligible for a permit. And you permit a movement, you permit an activity, and so that can involve one or more entities. So if we want raw milk to go from a farm to a processing plant, we need to minimally permit that movement, but that involves 3 entities: the farm, the truck, and the processing plant. So what California decided to do was to take a staged approach to this pre-certification process. And to start out with some of the education and training and working with industry to help them understand what's going to be required of them. Ultimately, to get the gold level pre-certification status, it will require demonstration of some of the actual cleaning and disinfection activities that farms would be required to accomplish. So this sort of also demonstrates that continuum of what is a permitted movement, who may be involved, and in the context of moving milk, we're talking about the farms, the haulers, may or may not include a wash station, depending upon how things are designed, a milk processor, and that pie chart in the center is just to remind me to make the point that there's a lot of other types of movements that we will be needing to deal with ultimately, but for right now, we're focusing on moving raw milk. So we used in California the California Dairy Quality Assurance Program model for the development and delivery of training to producers. We designed approximately 3-hour training session, and so far we've piloted it with 1 processing plant and 20 producers. We've now updated that curriculum based on the input we got, and we're in the process in, that should say 2014, of offering it now to 2 additional companies and rolling it out to their producers. We produced a binder, a foot and mouth disease secure milk supply template to help walk these producers through the process of developing their farm plan. During the training, we covered things on, and you'll see HMD for hoof and mouth disease kind of interchanged with FMD, foot and mouth disease, because the industry in California has asked that we try to use the term hoof and mouth disease when messaging currently to the industry to try to help the consumer appreciate that it's not a human health threat. So that's another whole discussion. But the reason the HMD is up there is because the California dairy industry asked that we do that. And this training was specifically designed for them. It's based on the California Foot and Mouth Disease Response Plan and how then they build their on-farm response plan. And we try to make it very concise, focused, friendly, step-by-step, check boxes. And we kind of called it the ABCs of building your foot and mouth disease response plan. So I mentioned the pre-certification levels, and they're gold, silver, bronze. They involve different levels of education, awareness, developing their plan, having the supplies they need to enact their plan on farm, and then having the specific employee training that's required been completed and documented. And then ultimately, to get the gold level, they have to successfully demonstrate that they can clean and disinfect the vehicles going on and off farm, as well as participate in the bulk milk tank sample collection. So I'm going to go through these slides pretty quick. These are some of the slides from the actual training that we developed. Some of the past California dairy QAP programs have used the concept of protecting your castle and a dairy figure called Dairyman Ted. And so moving forward, we're hoping that we might be able to get funding to actually be able to provide these as video modules that then could be web-based and more easily available in that format. The training we've done to date was done as sort of a team teaching activity. So we talked about the Secure Milk Supply, Hoof and Mouth Disease Emergency Response Plan, the ABCs. The A part is that they need to establish perimeter biosecurity. B component is they need to be able to clean and disinfect vehicles entering and exiting their farm. And C is they need to do herd monitoring for signs of disease. And that herd monitoring also has required reporting. So these next slides just kind of walk us through pieces of the template plan that we developed. And it's kind of, we teach it with this in front of them so that they can make notes and actually potentially complete parts of this plan while the training is ongoing. So, the continual message is that, failing to prepare is preparing to failing, and that the dairyman is ultimately the person who guards, the drawbridge to their castle and determines what gets to come on their farm and ultimately what risk their animals might be exposed to. So the plan includes documentation of emergency contact information, and then it includes, we walk them through how to design perimeter biosecurity for their farm. So in California, we start out, because of some of the previous work that's been done, all the dairies there have these aerial images because they had to use them as part of their wastewater management plan. So we can have them bring that to the class. And then using that and a series of symbols with colored crayons and pens, we have them essentially identify how they're going to do perimeter control on their farm. We give a couple different examples where we have an open road. This would be the dairy's perimeter. The blue is the animal housing perimeter, so the area in which all the live animals are contained. Potential vehicle points of egress, what needs to be blocked or controlled. Then the two opportunities for where cleaning and disinfection stations might be put up, depending upon how they want to manage their traffic flow. In this case, the one orange square disappeared because that's the milk parlor. And we're going to design a clean path that only the milk truck drives so that the milk tanker, in this case, would not need to be disinfected. There'd be a barrier line where the transfer hose crosses. And then there'd be employee parking areas and changing areas. And then this is just an illustration of a different farm design that has more of a long road coming off of the green line. So we walk through a couple different examples and help them figure out what makes the best sense for their farm. We go through securing the entry points and the signage that's required, providing them templates of the signage, as well as the vehicle logs that they would need to maintain, provide them instruction on how to handle business critical visitors, maintaining visitor logs, how to manage employees in terms of providing them proper PPE, and guidance on hand washing and cleaning and disinfection. We're starting there to introduce the concept about the dairy industry being prepared for short-term on-site calf rearing. We need to go there nationally. We haven't had a lot of dialogue on that nationally, but we got a lot of questions in the initial pilot training that we did from dairymen asking, well, what do we do about all these other movements? And then we kind of realized, well, gee, maybe being too focused just on the milk truck wasn't going to make sense. So we're looking at ways to add those features to that initial training. They also are then, and we develop like SOP templates for many of these activities. So in terms of how they will choose to accomplish cleaning and disinfection on their farm, we provide them a template where they can pick the disinfectant. We gave them options of either bleach, which is already an approved foot and mouth disease disinfectant, as well as citric acid, specific mixing instructions for those two compounds. It's not there are other FMD approved disinfectants available that could be used, but we were trying to keep it to simple options that would be easiest for a dairyman to implement in the face of a crisis or an emergency situation. It goes through went through some of the employee training on the herd monitoring side, and then ultimately to be gold certified, they will need to demonstrate that they can set up and actually clean and disinfect a vehicle. That's the goal. Herd monitoring, so knowing how to recognize the disease, tracking that information, and then ultimately reporting it. And in California, they've talked about CDFA has talked about a couple options for how they might receive that information. So there may be a web portal available to industry during an outbreak where they would be expected on a daily basis to go in and enter this information. Therefore, it would be electronically made available to those in the permit and movement section to continue to have that permit be active. So I didn't mention, permits also can be for one movement in time, or permits can be issued for a period of time given that certain conditions are met. And so the vision would be if they're pre-certified and approved initially for a permit, that as long as they continue to meet the conditions of the permit could be in place. And that would require the daily herd monitoring to be reported, as well as the continued cleaning and disinfection of those vehicles coming on the farm. And then ultimately, in the end, we wanted to give them the sort of the one page, what do you do, when the panic starts, based on the training we put together. And so this was kind of the summary take-home message of what to do if you get the call. And ideally, they have the plan that's there. They pull out the plan, they dust it off, they refer to it, they look at their map, they secure their perimeter, they post their signs, they set up their cleaning and disinfection station. Then they start to check their animals for foot and mouth disease, and then contact their creamery for further instructions. So this little bit I shared with you, there's a series of about, 19 documents that are available. They've been made available to all the state and regional partners to use and leverage in developing their training materials. So if anyone is interested in getting access to those, just let me know. I can invite you to join the shared site, it's a UC Davis secure shared site, where you can download these materials and look at them more in your leisure, but there's quite a bit more behind it. We only ask that if people use these materials in developing their own, that they provide an acknowledgement of the source of the material. One of the other things I wanted to discuss, and it sounds like it's follows well on the heels of some of the earlier discussion we've had today, are what are opportunities that might exist for the dairy industry to work to potentially mitigate either the duration or the impacts of some of the export losses that would occur, immediately, we heard, when an FMD outbreak is declared. The idea behind this is that in large part, the products that the dairy industry currently exports, things like lactose, non-fat dry milk powder, whey powder, go through pretty extensive processing such that they're highly likely to be have no active foot and mouth disease virus in them. And some cheeses might fall into this category. And ideally, and I'd love to get input from the trade folks that were here if they have other suggestions, or if I'm misspeaking, but ideally what you'd like to have in a perfect world is in the OIE Terrestrial Animal Health Code, where it specifies the conditions under which certain products can be traded from countries of certain statuses. And right now, there's only specific language in there for milk, fluid milk, and several processing options for that fluid milk. What you'd like to have in there is, another line that said lactose, or another line lactose powder, another line that said non-fat dry milk powder, and said that if processed under these conditions, or if minimally processed under these conditions, then there is no active foot and mouth disease virus in that product, therefore it should be considered safe for trade. And so as a first step towards providing information that might help those justifications, Dr. Ross Center at Iowa State was funded by the U.S. Dairy Export Council to do a review of the literature for all the published published information that was there regarding the inactivation of foot and mouth disease in milk and milk products. And so this kind of gives you information on the kill curves and what's known. Like everything, it's not perfect, but there's a fair amount of information there that can be used. In addition, combined with the already existing guidelines in terms of what's considered acceptable in trading fluid milk, to then pair that. And so food scientists or people from the dairy processing industry that know what those processing conditions are could make the justification that those products are indeed safe to trade. And given that information is put together, then they can work with USDA import-export folks there are periodic opportunities to ask for revisions to the OIE Terrestrial Animal Health Code. So when those opportunities arise, if that information is available, there's an opportunity to ask that it be reviewed, and then ideally could be added specifically to the code, which would put any country who would want to trade those types of commodities in a potentially better position to resume trade more quickly, or ideally not have that trade stop, but that may be unrealistic just based on the pure politics of things. So with that, most of the information that I referred to today is posted through our website, secuремilksupply.org. As I mentioned, if anybody's interested in the training materials developed as part of the California effort, I'd be happy to connect you with that website.